People are still joining, but I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a couple of introductory remarks, and then we'll move right into the program. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is the fourth and the final day of our annual Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program put on by the CU Center for Bioethics and Humanities. I'm Matt Winia. I direct the center. Today is the day Yom HaShoah in Israel. It's the official day of remembrance. We, in the United States, there is a federally designated week of remembrance. And so we have programming around the legacy of health professional involvement in the Holocaust that spans all four of our CU campuses and the entirety of the week. But we're particularly pleased today to have a panel to discuss our theme of for the year, which is around courage, complicity, and compromise, and the choices that health professionals are sometimes faced with today that can be informed by this history. For those of you who are not familiar with the Holocaust, Genocide, Contemporary Bioethics program, we do this to promote education, scholarship, and community engagement on the lessons of the Holocaust for healthcare and society. In the past, as I mentioned, we invite our keynotes to present in-person events across all four of our CU campuses. This year, of course, looks different. This year, we've been doing daily virtual programming at noon, Monday through Thursday, on a series of related topics. And I want to extend a special thank you to those of you who've been in the audience with us all week for each of these events. Before we officially start, I want to thank our silver level sponsors, the Rose Community Foundation and Jewish Colorado, for their generous support of this program, as well as all of our promotional partners and the Dr. William S. Silvers Fund. He created the Holocaust, Genocide, Contemporary Bioethics Program Fund and Endowment in 2015. And I just want to say this program would not be possible without the support of these sponsors and our many donors, large and small. This is our fifth annual program since I moved here to Colorado, and since we've been officially hosting it at the CU Center for Bioethics and Humanities. There has been a program in existence, at least off and on, since 2008. And in that regard, I'd like to thank the community members who are part of our Holocaust, Genocide, Contemporary Bioethics Advisory Group, and especially our Lessons Learned Committee, who played a big role in planning our annual programming altogether, but especially this program today. If you'd like more information on becoming a sponsor or a donor or a promotional partner, or if you want to explore the past programs that we've had, or just want to learn more about how you can get involved, please visit our website. We'll be putting that into the chat so you can find it easily. I do have a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our moderator for this program. First, since this always gets asked, yes, this program is being recorded. And yes, we will send you the link. Once this program is done, we'll send the link out to everyone who RSVP'd. We'll also post this to our website at coloradobioethics.org, all one word, under our past events. That'll go up within a day or two usually. Second, we have 90 minutes for today's program, which should leave us plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. And I would encourage you, rather than using the chat, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It's much easier for the moderators to navigate that. And finally, I want to be sure to mention one of our partner organizations, the Mountain States ADL, will be holding their 40th annual Governor's Remembrance event virtually this evening from 5:30 to 7. It will feature Holocaust survivor Judith Altman, and the link to that program, which is free and open to the public, will be put into the chat. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Mark Levine. Dr. Levine is a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and a faculty associate in our Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and he chairs the Lessons Learned Working Group of the Holocaust, Genocide, Contemporary Bioethics program. Dr. Levine served for 7 years on the American Medical Association's Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs, including a year as chair. This is the group that is the steward of the AMA's Code of Medical Ethics. And he's also served as the Chief Medical Officer in the Denver Regional Office for the Federal Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Mark, thank you so much for all of your work on this program, and thank you for moderating the panel discussion today. You are muted.
Yeah, no longer. Thank you so much for that introduction. I greatly appreciate it. I am looking for my slides. Can you see this? Whoops, pardon me. I seem to be in a bit of a quandary here.
Do you see the green share button?
The Lessons Learned Work Group has been a focus of the, wait a minute. I am trying to get my slides up, but I don't see it as how I can do that. So
do you see a green share button?
I do, but I
click on.
Yeah, but from that, I'm not able to get to where I wish to. So my apologies. Oh, there's
Mark,
my slide.
If you want, you could email your slides. Oh, actually, I'm seeing your slides now.
Okay. The Lessons Learned Work Group came about because as part of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program, we have been meeting regularly as an advisory group to consider how do we promote scholarship and community engagement on the lessons of the Holocaust for healthcare and society. And the question came up in one of those meetings, what exactly are the lessons of the Holocaust? As a result of that, we have put together a group that meets on a monthly basis, which is open to community members. And we have a group that meets regularly on a monthly basis to discuss the lessons of the Holocaust. As a result of that, we have produced a number of products, including a couple of publications, as well as some programs designed to communicate to the community what those lessons actually are. We did a program in partnership with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science on trust in science, which we think is an important lesson from the Holocaust. We are also in the final stages of putting together a program on competing interests in healthcare, as that too was an important lesson from the Holocaust. And today's program too is an extension of that. And I am, there we go. And our topic today is moral courage in healthcare, which is certainly something that is appropriate to discuss in the context of the health professional engagement with the Holocaust. We are delighted and honored to have as our panelists today Barbara Morris, who is a geriatrician with Stride Community Health Center in, I believe, in Jefferson County. Janine Young, a pediatrician who works at Denver Health for their refugee services program and human rights clinic. Mendel Popack, who is a rabbi and executive director of the Jewish Life Center and Chabad Denver North. and Abby Leibowitz, who is a medical student between her 3rd and 4th year, but currently also a student for in the School of Public Health at Harvard, where she is a candidate for a Master's of Public Health degree, et cetera. So with that in mind, I would like to call upon the panelists. First, Dr. Morris, to tell us a little bit about herself and her background, as well as a few words regarding moral challenges that she might have experienced or witnessed, and perhaps on what motivated her to react or behave as she did. So Barbara?
Thanks so much, Mark, and everyone. And first of all, let me extend my appreciation to the center and the sponsors. I have to tell all of you that I am incredibly humbled to be part of this group, and I feel frankly dwarfed by the magnitude and extent of courage that's been expressed this week by individuals and groups. Mark has given us a guideline, which is rather short in terms of time, so I will try not to speed talk through this. My New York background will come through, but I do want to tell you a little bit about the events of the summer of 2019 and the aftermath of those events. And I would like to say at the outset that this is just one example of many in decades of career in healthcare, but I think it's an important one. And I do look forward to hearing your questions and your comments as we go through. So I will actually start at the end, which is also the beginning. This week, I welcomed a new patient to my practice, a 90-year-old lifelong Denverite. When I asked her why she had chosen to come and see me, she said, "I've been looking for you ever since you were fired." So a little bit of background about myself. I'm a family physician. I specialize in the care of older adults. I've trained and practiced in a philosophy of primary care and enduring relationships with patients and their families, which has been very important through decades of practice. I've been an employed physician my entire career for both large and small groups. And over those decades, I've developed a practice philosophy of respecting patients' values and wishes. And that began decades ago when I was medical director of a long-term care and rehab hospital in Cincinnati, where we faced gritty clinical decisions every single day. The events in question, though, started in 2013 when I started working for Centura as a clinical geriatrician and a medical director for senior services. As an employed physician, I signed a contract that included a clause about complying with the Catholic ethical and religious directives. Those of you from Colorado know that Centura is sponsored by a Catholic organization and the Adventists. And at the time, perhaps being naive, I did not see the ethical and religious directives as an issue for me. I was no longer practicing care of younger adults, and so reproductive issues were not really an issue for me and my practice. In the fall of 2016, many of you are aware the Colorado End-of-Life Options Act came up for a vote, and this was to allow patients to use medical aid in dying if they were terminally ill. It was actively discussed, and interestingly enough, Centura did not think that the statute would pass. When they realized that it would pass, and in fact, it passed overwhelmingly in the state, they began preparing their policy to opt out of the statute. Now, it would take a lot of time to explain the opt-out language and the whole statute, and I won't go through all of that, but just to say that the language of the statute is very specific. It says that organizations can opt out of having participation in medical aid in dying for those patients who would wish to take the medication on the facility's premises. So I'd just like you to remember that phrase as we go through this. In the winter of 2017, Centura implemented their opt-out policy. It was broader than the statute, and it forbade any employed physicians from participating in any way in medical aid in dying, no matter where the patient wanted to make use of that medication. And I, on several occasions in 2017 through 2019, expressed my concerns to senior leadership and to the legal team at Centura about how the policy was written and what my concerns were. Despite those efforts, Centura maintained the policy and said that even though they were aware the policy was broader than the statute, they would keep it in place. In the summer of 2019, my patient Neil came to me with a devastating diagnosis of terminal cancer. He requested assistance with medical aid in dying, and he was very well informed about the statute and what his rights were as a patient. I was forced at that time in a very difficult conversation to tell him that I could not participate because of Centura's policy. We discussed multiple referral options, none of which he felt were suitable, and I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier about relationships and how patients and families value those relationships. And Neil did not want to change healthcare systems. He was also concerned about the policy, and he wanted to help other patients in the future. So feeling that we had no other options, we filed what's called a declaratory action. This was learning for me, and we asked the court to review the policy versus the statute and give us an opinion. That declaratory action was filed on a Thursday at the end of August, and on that Monday, I was fired. Now, I've been employed for a long time, and I was walked out the door. As I was walking out the door of my office, I asked the administrator what we should do about my patients, my other 399 patients, actually. And the reply was, "Oh, no worries, we'll take care of your patients." You can imagine that I was rather shell-shocked, and I have this memory of waking up on the Tuesday morning in my mountain home, looking at my dog, thinking, what am I doing here? I'm supposed to be at work. This, of course, had a devastating effect on myself, my family, my patient, and my 399 other patients. The reaction, I think, was interesting, and we can talk more about in the question and answer. I received responses locally and around the country from colleagues, from friends, from strangers, from patients. I had patients texting me and calling me. But I would note that I had essentially no contact from my friends and colleagues at Centura. I will not go into the details of the legal proceedings at this point. There are public documents for any of you who are interested, but just to say that those proceedings are still in progress, and it has taken a long time, and I would say that difficult to recover from all of this. So in order not to take too much more time, I would just like to focus a little bit on the issues and my reflections. Faith-based health systems and state statutes. This is a big issue, what trumps what and whose rights are at stake here. Market forces in healthcare. What about patients' rights and access to care that they deserve and that is legal in their states? Those of you on the west side of town know that we have a huge faith-based presence here, and it's actually not easy for patients to find care outside of faith-based systems, nor for physicians to find employment outside of there. There are contractual issues that some of you have asked some questions about, which we can get to later. And the huge question, which is how can clinicians handle substantive policy conflicts with their employers? And what happens to each of us when attempts to handle those conflicts internally are not successful? So some reflections. I've been thinking a lot about this all week. Is this moral courage? I don't know the answer to that. I do know that at some point we have to stand up for ourselves and for our patients. I wonder how clinicians can help each other in a changing world where corporate medicine has become the norm. And the real issue is, what issues will we stand up for and take both personal and professional risk? So I'll return to the beginning and the end. When the patient said, "I've been looking for you since you were fired," that tells me that our patients need and want us to stand up. Thank you.
And thank you, Barbara. That was wonderful. Janine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, and I have a little bit less formal approach, so I'm going to do this a little bit off the cuff. But so I'm a general pediatrician. I've been in practice for about 20 years, and I've always worked with immigrants and refugees. People ask me why, and I think there are lots of reasons. One is I find it incredibly interesting. I think language and culture and food and my patients allowing me to live and experience some of their lives and travel through them is incredible. I think my patients open my eyes to different cultural practices and beliefs. But I think ultimately they allow me to see the shared humanity that we all have. In that, as a pediatrician, when parents come in, whether if they're from Somalia or Denver or Dallas, they all have the same worries and concerns and needs about their children. So that's how I think why I've got into immigrant and refugee health. I spent a year after medical school, and one of the participants on here reminded me of this, in South Africa, working during apartheid in a township in an emergency room. I've always been interested in working with incredibly underserved populations and people who have been discriminated against, whether that stems from my history, my own personal history of grandparents who fled the Holocaust from the Ukraine and Poland, and me maybe personally realizing that I wouldn't even be here today talking to you all if my ancestors weren't allowed in the country. I think that there is a palpable part of what I do that stems from that. And I would say that the biggest moral challenges that I faced most recently as a pediatrician is the unaccompanied children that have been streaming across our borders, our southern borders, since 2014 was actually the first big bolus of unaccompanied children when President Obama was in office. The lack of standards that exist at the federal level throughout this time period, and obviously through the Trump administration, which was jaw-dropping in its lack of humanity, forcing these children to stay on the Mexican side of the border by themselves for months and months without shelter, without protection. And I've seen the direct impact in running the refugee clinic at Denver Health and our human rights clinic of teenagers who'd been raped over in Mexico who have children from those rapes. And what is our obligation as a society, an open society, a democracy that has been really threatened over the past 4 years in speaking out for children? If we can't speak out and fight for rights of children wherever they're from, God help us. I find it shocking that, and Dickinsonian in a lot of ways, that what I used to read or continue to read about in the Holocaust and other episodes of current ethnic cleansing, that we're sort of back where we were. And so how do we give a voice to children and their parents, frankly? And if I were in this position, fleeing my country because I'm being threatened by drug traffickers, forcing my children to join gangs, I would be in the same position now. And so I feel it incredibly important for medical providers in general to speak clearly about what they see, to write about it, to talk about it in places like these important forums, and then to try to push policy changes. So right now, I see patients individually. I get these stories, but I also am dipping my toes, whether I like it or not, into policy on the state level and the national level, working with National American Academy of Pediatrics, working with some of our state representatives, and really trying to find solutions at the state level and frankly at the federal level of what we are supposed to do with these hundreds of thousands of children, some who still haven't been reunited with their parents from separation that the Trump administration perpetrated. And so I appreciate being welcome to this forum. I clearly am very passionate about my patients and their cultures, and I have a great respect for all of my patients and families wherever they're from. So thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak with you all.
And thank you, Janine. Rabbi Mendel, we would welcome your introduction to yourself and response to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Thank you everyone for joining. And thank you to my fellow panelists. So I'm joining this panel as a rabbi, not as a physician. And so the approach that I'm going to take here in the next few minutes is less from a medical perspective, more from a broader question of moral decisions in that respect. And throughout the discussion, I think that might be my approach in the discussion, as it would apply to really anybody and specifically in this situation. Being that today is Yom HaShoah, commemorating the loss of the 6 million Jews and the millions of others who perished in the Holocaust in World War II. Continuing through, this is the Holocaust and Genocide and Contemporary Bioethics program throughout the past number of decades, where many others lost their lives to hateful crimes, until even very recently in our own state in Boulder. So I'd like to take a minute to commemorate the memory of those as a rabbi in the form of the way we do in Jewish tradition. In doing so, I think it will lead into what I would like to share. The Jewish tradition has a custom to commemorate the soul and to honor the soul of those who have passed by studying part of the oral law called the Mishnah, because the Mishnah in Hebrew is the same letters as the word neshama, which means a soul. And so in honoring the memory of all those who are lost, I'd like to read a Mishnah from Tractate Sanhedrin. This is the original compendium of the Jewish oral law written in the 2nd century, and it reads as follows. I'll read the first line in Hebrew and then the rest in English. Lefichach nivra adam yechidi. Initially, only one human was created, to teach us that one who destroys a single life is considered to have destroyed the entire world. And one who saves a single life is considered to have saved the entire world. Another reason why initially only one human being was created was to maintain harmony among humanity, that one person would not be able to say to another, my progenitor is greater than yours. A third reason is so that heretics should not say that there are many gods, each creating its own line of humanity. And a fourth reason, to communicate the greatness of God, for when a person mints many coins from the same mold, all the coins are alike, but God mints every person through the mold of the first human, and yet no two people are alike. Therefore, every person must say the world was created for me. Those are the words of the Mishnah, a very powerful teaching that has found its manifestation in many cultures and societies. And being that we're coming from Passover, as always, Yom HaShoah does follow Passover, I'd like to start by sharing what I think is nothing in the lines of the moral challenges that Dr. Morris and Young have faced, but I think that also is a moral challenge in its own right, was the lack as a community leader of community opportunities to gather in the past year. People find their comfort and their identity in the communities within which we gather. People find their comfort in the counsel of the spiritual leaders of their faith, and that was not something that was possible for my community and friends here this year. And so we had to prioritize the health and safety and make the decision that the lives of our constituents take priority over the continuation of growing our community. We have a community, we like to say, of any Jew that moves. And so everybody is welcome, regardless of their level of observance or affiliation. And therefore, we have people of many different perspectives on current events and how those current events should be dealt with. And I had to make the firm decision that this is the approach we're taking as a community to protect people's lives, even though there were many that felt very comfortable taking a different approach. So in saying that, I felt that was a moral decision. And I'll try to speak a few minutes to that while keeping to the constraints of my time. The Torah, I think the Bible relates what I believe to be the first moral decision made by a medical practitioner written in the scripture. And that is when the Pharaoh calls in the end of the first chapter of Exodus, the two midwives, and asks them to kill the Jewish male children that are born to the Jews. And the line in the last, second to last verse says, and the midwives feared God and did not do as Pharaoh instructed them to do, and did not kill the boys. And I reflected a lot in the context of this lessons learned group and this discussion on how that stands in the face of so much that was going on in that society. Because there are some truths that are not so self-evident, contrary to what Thomas Jefferson declared. And those truths are not so self-evident that all men are created equal. And they are not so self-evident that every person is endowed with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because as we study human history, that just wasn't the case. And we can start back in the times of the Roman Republic, where infanticide was common. Even in their constitution, the 12 tablets, the fourth tablet stated that a father has a right of life and death over his children. Even in the book, one of the oldest medical texts called Gynecology by the Greek physician, the first century physician, Soranus of Ephesus, if I pronounce that right, he writes, there's a chapter there that starts with the title, How to Determine a Child That is Worthy of Keeping Alive. And that seems like it's antiquity, but if we fast forward throughout history, we see the inequalities, the way people were sold as property, how life was cheap, and only certain classes of life were given value. As Plato said, certain people are created as gold, others are created as silver, and then there are just those who are created as copper. And the people that are gold dehumanize those who are copper. And that throughout all of history, it was always punishing the other through the Holocaust. And even in contemporary times in our country, with the forced sterilization programs and the syphilis experiments, and even today there are articles that I found in the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2013, which is titled "After Birth Abortion: Why Should the Baby Live?" And this is published, and this is not so self-evident that every person has a right to life, as that author writes. The moral status of an infant is equivalent to that of a fetus, in the sense that both lack the properties that justify the attribution of a right to life to an individual. So the real question goes back to the two midwives, and what is it that they had within them that allowed them to stand up to the face of tyranny that the Pharaoh demanded from them? And I would like to argue, and I'd like to submit today a suggestion that perhaps could lead into a further discussion, that it's encapsulated in the words that they fear God. And I don't view that as a particularly religious statement as it applies to any specific religion, but I do think that it embodies the idea that the Bible introduced to the world, that human beings are created in, quote, the image of God. That concept encapsulates the idea that every human being is endowed with a purpose. Because if one is to believe that the world was created by a purposeful creator, then every being carries within it an inherent value, an inherent purpose. There's no one who is dispensable or disposable. And therefore, they feared means they respected. They respected the image of God within each of the children that were born. And therefore, when we're unable to eliminate that just to serve the utility of the society or the government or whatever it was. And this is something that took a long time to take root in society, but in today's world, I don't know that it's so self-evident either, as we see in the, what was once the gladiator matches is today perhaps the mixed martial arts competitions, where people are taken out on hospital stretchers, where today was once infanticide is today as Dr. Young was saying, is the way that the young are treated on the border. It stems from the same lack of recognition of the inherent value of life that is within every single one of us, and the morality that we demand from ourselves, which is that which asks us to conduct ourselves above just the rule of law. And the obligations as the Judeo-Christian values are, it's dependent on the love of God, the love of our neighbor, and the love of a stranger. And societies are built on shared morality. And it's only when we all carry within us the same shared moral code that we can live together in an environment with a shared moral sense. And so I think the question that I'd like to leave here is, to continue the conversation, is how does one in the field of medicine develop this ability to constantly be able to see you can call it the humanity, I'll call it the spark of God within each of their patients, so that is the priority and not the needs of the corporation, the needs of the government, society at large, or even their own personal values, perhaps. I think that might be a question of how do we cultivate that within people who are training in the medicine and all of society in general.
Thank you, Mendel. Appreciate that very much. Let's turn now to our medical and public health student, Abby. Please.
Hi, everyone. I am extremely humbled to be on this panel. Definitely a little intimidating to start talking after just an impressive sort of storyteller and moral thinker. So thank you, Rabbi. I would say that my journey in medicine, similar to what Dr. Young mentioned, is intimately tied up with my family history. I am also from a Jewish family and grew up reading books of the Holocaust and identifying with that character and seeing myself in the person who is facing this unbelievable persecution. And so as I've been in medicine, I think that has naturally led me to imagine who I would be if I were born into the situations, if I endured some of the challenges, some of the trauma that we see with our patients every day. And I'm going into emergency medicine, which is the safety net care for all of society. And as such, we see all of the failings of society. And what I love about emergency medicine, unfortunately, we don't have long-term relationships, but I have the chance to be there when things are really at their worst, and to be there for people when it feels like everything is darkness. And one of the challenges for me has been that medicine can feel incredibly limited. The tools of clinical medicine are small. And so that has led me to pursue the master's in public health, to think about all what we call the social determinants of health, or all of the things outside of the clinical sphere that affect how a person lives. And one of the areas of interest for me has been healthcare for incarcerated populations. So this first became an issue when I sort of got more exposed to this in emergency medicine. I didn't have a lot of exposure growing up. I was luckily insulated from those effects. But learning about it as a medical student and then studying it in public health, it felt impossible not to do anything. And so currently in Massachusetts, and actually all over the country, COVID-19 has absolutely ravaged prisons. People in prisons are dying and getting infected with COVID at unbelievable rates. And so I have been working with a legal group in Massachusetts that is fighting to say we need to release people from prison as a response to COVID-19. And that has been an extremely eye-opening experience to work very much outside of the traditional medicine. We've been sort of going through legal briefs and trying to do expert opinions and all of that. And it has made me really consider, what is our obligation, not just within our own profession, because there is a huge amount of discrimination still within medicine, but then what is our obligation in the rest of society? What is our obligation to talk about housing and the treatment of incarcerated populations and racism and all of these giant issues when we feel like we are just medical professionals? And so the only thing that I will leave you with is, I think it can feel like we don't have the power to do anything. And especially as a medical student, I often felt that way. But I found that even as a medical student, where I felt like I was really at the bottom of the hierarchy, there were always ways to, in some ways, resist. So for a very simple example, in my clinical rotations, I would always insist on asking why things were done the very particular way they were. And I had the benefit of coming from this place of almost ignorance to be able to ask the question, but just asking the question allows you to stop for a second and think about, what are we doing and is this the right thing? And so it didn't require a lot of power. You know, I wasn't changing policies, but I think it shows that everyone, regardless of their place, can be doing something. So.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you also to the other panelists for your perspective on this, raising all kinds of interesting issues regarding what is the nature of morality in healthcare and where does it lead to. You have at least the three clinicians and also the rabbi's comments have talked about that interface with between our responsibility to the patients and the people who look up to us for guidance and what our goals and are in what we do. People have called a lot of the challenges that are faced by the physicians and other clinicians today who are burning out and feeling under pressure and anxiety for inability to carry out their professional obligations because of competition with other obligations to, for instance, their employer. And I think Barbara's comments are very instructive in that regard. How do we help those other clinicians and those people that we work with who are experiencing what is being called moral injury, moral insult, as they try to carry out their professional obligations in the face of continuing administrative resistance and pressure for production and things that interfere with their commitment to their patients? How can we help our compatriots, compatriot clinicians in approaching that?
I can try to have an answer to this, at least from my mind, and sort of how I've tried to stay sane in some of this, because I think we're always confronted in medicine with these ethical and moral dilemmas. And Abby, you described something that I think happened to me in my training, which is you see something over and over again, whether you're in the emergency room seeing incarcerated patients without rights, or whatever the issue is, unaccompanied children, people who are uninsured and undocumented who are living in the shadows. And you can do it over and over again in clinical medicine. And I think we've all experienced this. You see the patient every 20 minutes. And at some point, you say either I'm burnt out, I'm not going to do this anymore. Or you say, this is really hard and I need to find another way to address this issue. And for Abby, you're getting your MPH, and I applaud you for doing that. And you're sort of taking this to a different level and looking at it from legal sides, from, again, the 20,000 foot view of how do we identify issues and then affect change on a larger scale, speaking out, writing articles, doing research. And so for me personally, and for colleagues who I admire, who are doing the same things in the face of COVID, I have a very close colleague in infectious disease who has seen that COVID vaccine is not being delivered to the most affected communities that have been devastated by COVID. So she got a grant and started delivering vaccines in these communities. And I think it's the energy and the moral compass, I think, behind what you see that drives a lot of us. I don't know what to say about people who I think it's hard because it can be exhausting, but I'd love to hear what other people have thoughts on this.
So I appreciate those comments, and it's such a good and challenging question, Mark, and everyone. I think one of the things I reflect on is, having been an employed physician for all these decades in different settings, I don't want to come away with people feeling like that's all bad. After the events of 2019, some people said to me, well, why did you stay in 2017 and 18 and 19? And, my answer at that time was, well, it's complicated. I had a practice within the big Centura system that I felt very good about. I had managed to find my niche in geriatrics. I was able, within this big system, to find my place and my world, and felt like I could keep my relationships with my patients, which, as you've heard, was a primary value for me. And so it wasn't so simple as just to say, well, I don't like this policy, so I'm out of here. Although sometimes now I think maybe I should have done that. But seriously, I think these are complex situations. And so when I talk with colleagues about this who call and say, what shall I do? Shall I stay or leave? I try to get people to look at, on balance, are they able to provide in a way that is right for them in their heart, for their patients? And if they are, then to kind of figure out what to do with the rest of the picture. And I think that's challenging. The other issue we have, particularly in primary care, is we have lost some of our old collegial physicians lounge kind of relationships. So we're actually quite isolated now in ambulatory care. We're all, as you've all heard, very busy, and we don't have that, walking into the doctor's lounge, talking to a colleague in another specialty, having that kind of support that we had in the past. And there's certainly lots of efforts regarding resilience and burnout for professionals, of course, not just physicians, that I think are gaining traction and will be really important. And I'm very much in favor of those. I think just this kind of conversation alone, it's so great to be with other people, even if it's on Zoom, and hear different approaches. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, when our kids were little, a long time ago, my husband used to say, look, let's not have any Vietnams here. Let's not argue about which color shoes the kid wears, or let's not fight battles we can't win or don't want to win. And I'm often reminded of that, and I've told people that as an employed physician, there are some things that we might not like, the office hours, the color of the carpet, how many patients we see, but those might not be the things that are our highest priority. So I guess I go back to the beginning again, which is if we can keep our relationships front and center, and when those are, and our medical care and our relationship with the patient as a priority, then hopefully we can somehow figure out some ways to work through these other issues.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in?
Dr. Levine, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Abby.
I was just going to add one thing quickly. I think in addition to finding a way to be active against whatever it is that you're fighting, I think as clinicians, we often feel the need to know everything and have all the answers and to put up this front. And I think one of the most freeing things is to be really honest with your patients, to lay your cards out on the table and say, I would really like to do X, but I'm not allowed to for these reasons, and be honest about how that makes you feel and how you're sorry and all of that. But I think having that discussion and being able to share a little bit of your vulnerability as well can be very healing when you're dealing with sort of things that are outside your control.
So I'm not, like I started, I'm not a doctor, but I actually wanted to channel your question, Dr. Levine, towards Abby. If you can actually, I'm going to turn it into another question for you, which I'd be interested to hear. So we run Jewish student life at the campus as well, here at the UC Health Campus. And one of the things that I've heard from students in the lessons learned group was the idea that a student generally enters medical school very idealistic, and over the course of the training, there's a certain sense of empathy that's sort of drummed out of them. And this is, I may be oversimplifying what I've been hearing, but by the time 4 years go by, that empathy has sort of been muted to a certain extent, which perhaps affects then their practice and then the sense of burnout that comes from that. So can you speak for a minute about what does happen during your, what did happen during your medical training, and what you would like, how would you reflect on that in positive or the opposite?
I think you're absolutely correct that people come into medical school pretty idealistic, and I think there's a lot of data to show, not just stories, that does get reduced over time. I think obviously there are some aspects of learning it from the culture of medicine, from people above you who are a little bit more cynical, who are making assumptions about your patients that you might not otherwise make. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that if you are a very empathetic person, being in medicine can be extremely traumatic. You see so much sort of horror on a daily basis that I think to really have your heart on the table every day is hard to do. I think it's hard to be a good physician, work clinical full hours, and do that all the time. So if I work a week in the emergency room, I will treat multiple people who have been abused, multiple people who are in a cycle of addiction that is drowning them, people who are dying, people, all of that together. And so I think there's a lot to say in terms of the medical education system and what we can do to preserve that empathy. I think we also need to talk about the secondary trauma that exists and how we do or don't help medical students and professionals to process that. Because I think, at least in medical school, when we talk about wellness, we talk about it in terms of work hours and eating right and exercising and all those lovely things, but we don't really talk about all that secondary trauma. And I think that, to a large extent, affects particularly the people who would be the most empathetic, who come in the most idealistic. It's hard.
Thank you. Terrific discussion. Here's a question for you. Does a physician always have a responsibility to speak out when they have a feeling of what's right? And I think to the recent example that we saw publicly of Dr. Scott Atlas, who took a contrarian view on the management of this COVID epidemic, saying that masks and social distancing were not necessary, that we don't need all of these precautions. Let's just let everybody get the infection naturally and herd immunity will come and go away. Did he have an ethical and moral obligation to speak? Does every physician have an ethical and moral obligation to speak out when they feel strongly about something?
I'll dip my toe into that one. For starters, I think it's unethical what he did because he's speaking from a place where he's not an expert. And I mean, this is what we've been struggling with, is who is an expert and where do we find our information? And so I think we as physicians have to check ourselves and, as Abby said, acknowledge what we know and acknowledge what we don't know, and then seek out experts in any field to help us and guide us. Because I'm not an expert in everything. And if I thought that I was, I would be harming my patients directly by not calling my colleague who's the bioethicist, who I'm going to be calling this weekend about a case, and the urologist, et cetera. So I think he was completely unethical in what he did.
It's also worth considering what was the purpose of his speaking out, right? If he were correct that mask wearing wasn't necessary and all of these things, people might have a little bit more normality in their life. But if he's wrong, there were thousands of lives at stake. And so I think it's worth considering, why are you speaking out? And if you're speaking out because you believe and you're an expert in this area that you are doing the best to preserve life, I think that is your obligation. But you have to really consider, what is the purpose of that minority opinion?
Any other thoughts?
Can I take a sort of higher level dip on that? I'm going to try to address this if without addressing the actual matter itself, because like Dr. Young, like you said, you know, you need an expert to actually comment on the correctness or the incorrectness of his statements. I think the question that, the philosophical question that might be worth asking here is, how do you define morality again, and what is considered ethical? In other words, the way I understand morality, it obviously has many definitions and there's many different aspects of it. What's relevant to here is a code of values that are intrinsic to me, within which I create my own personal obligations beyond the letter of the law. And it's those sort of inherent values that drive my behaviors. And morality for one person might be my autonomy. It might be my independent rights. And that comes before the collective rights or even the welfare of those around me. And if that's the ethics of this particular physician, if that would be the case, or anybody for that matter, if that's what if that is the rights that we're talking about, then he was acting courageously to defend his moral values of independent rights. And anyone that identified with that, you know, felt that he was representing them. I think that a different perspective on morality, moving away from rights, is more about responsibility. And I think that that is something that Judaism and Christianity and Islam and all the monotheistic faiths demand or teach, and that is that we are responsible. You know, the question of Cain and Abel, where God asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" and he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" basically is the question. If I'm not my brother's keeper, then why should I care about my brother? And that extends to my neighbor and to the stranger. But if I am my brother's keeper and I have a responsibility to my neighbor and to the stranger across the border and across the sea, so then, you know, a little bit of discomfort that takes away my own personal comfort level, that gets put to the side for the sake of the collective we, for the caring for my neighbor. And so I think, to Abby, to your question is, what was the value that was driving his question, if perhaps his value was not coming from a question of medicine? And even if it was, the fact that there are countries, you know, like Brazil, where they just let it go and he just basically denied the importance of protecting people's lives, or other countries like that, you know, that's a question of what are the values that bind us as a society and that drive the moral fabric of our country and the policymakers creating laws and regulations around us.
It's good.
Thank you. Another perspective on that dialogue, I think, has to do with the difference between morality and ethics. There's a professional responsibility to defend science. And his opinions within a dialogue of science, I think, would be perfectly acceptable as dialogue, trying to seek a common truth. But to take opinion as a physician and turn it immediately into public policy, bypassing the dialogue of science, I think is a violation of professional responsibility, therefore, in my mind, unethical. Whether it's contrary to a formal code of ethics is somewhat debatable. But I think there are other times when we can see a conflict between professional ethics and one's morals. And I'll present to you, suppose that you are the physician caring for Adolf Hitler, who has a life-threatening condition. And you have the opportunity to treat him and return him to work, which is your professional responsibility, but may conflict with your morals. And recognizing that returning him to work places many, many others at risk. What is your responsibility? Is it to your morals or to your ethics? Nobody wants to pick up that hot potato, huh?
This has come up many times in discussions. You know, the Syrian president, who is an ophthalmologist by training, and where are his morals and professional ethics? I want to throw it back at you, Dr. Levine. I think it's a really tough question. I guess if I knew that he was going to be tried then and not be brought back to what he was doing, then absolutely I would save him. I don't know, what would you do?
My personal response would be, I'm not sure I would use the most aggressive treatment. I think there are times when your morality and the weight of a individual life versus the presence of being able to save many, many other lives would take precedence in my mind. But I would welcome hearing what others feel about that.
I would agree with that. I think this it is so hard because the way the question is posed, it's the if this then that, and our responsibility clinically is really usually to deal with what's in front of us. But let's be honest, it would be very hard to not have this voice saying, what am I really doing? And I think that individually we could do what we're trained to do and what we have, I think, an ethical obligation to do. But it is very challenging because then you're accepting possible consequences after doing that. Either way, right? Whatever action you take. So
the slippery slope in some ways, because so you're also saying that Hitler is presented to you and you already know everything that he did. And then, but we're presented and with cases, especially in, if you're an emergency room physician, where maybe you know a little bit about the person, and maybe you don't. And so are you going to sort of in your mind start saying, well, I've heard that this person has done these awful things, but I'm not sure if it's real. I understand it. Hitler was awful. But then you're sort of becoming like in your mind, you're like trying the person in your mind, are they guilty or not, while you're trying to actually save them at the same time. I think it's hard. I think it's a hard question. Hitler should have died a long time, should have died and should never have existed. But what do you do with all the other cases that are not so obvious? Or maybe they're obvious to you and you hate this person because they've done something wrong. But how wrong does that wrong have to be before you say, well, I'm not going to treat them?
Can I again, I sometimes try to pull the question away from its specifics to the broader, to address the issue at hand. You would never ask the question if you saw Hitler on the battlefield, whether you should pull the trigger. There would never be a question about bombing his palatial residence in the mountains if you knew he was there during the war. So the question of, do you treat him and send him back to his role as the Führer, committing the atrocities in a time of war, when you treating him is just getting him back up and out when he's part of the enemy. So the question, I don't think, is, do you see the humanity in your enemy? I think that if we believe that there's a spark of the divine in every single human being, then your enemy is included in that. In fact, there's an interesting tradition that we don't sing certain verses of praise on the last days of Passover, because those are the days that the Bible tells us the Egyptians were drowned. And how can we celebrate when God's creations are being drowned in the sea? And these are the people that oppressed and enslaved the Jewish people only a week prior to that, cementing their babies into the walls, and as all the stories are told. So we don't celebrate the downfall of our enemy. We don't dehumanize our enemy. But when it comes to, do we, the question of protecting ourselves by taking a life of someone who is out to kill us, I think that question is a different question. And the way you formulated the question was sending him back to his role. But if we had him in our custody, how often is a terrorist captured in Israel and then they save his life in the hospital while he's singing the death to the country in the emergency room? How often does a criminal come into an emergency room after shooting people and law enforcement, and the doctor is asked to treat them, but that person is now in custody? I think that the question is multifaceted. To break it down, I think there's no obligation to save someone who is out to kill you. There's only an obligation to try to stop them without killing them first. And if you can't, there is a moral obligation to protect your own life. And I think that Hitler has posed a direct threat to all of humanity in that respect.
I tend to feel strongly that you should provide Hitler the same level of care. I think the way we have designed our society, no one person should be judge, jury, and executioner. I don't know that anyone has the power, and as physicians, society has certainly not bestowed that power on us. So I think it would be a transgression of our responsibility to do anything less. And I think for me also, I think about the first responsibility is do no harm. And if I know that I can do benefit, but I don't do it, to me, that feels the same. And as Dr. Young mentioned, this does come up, and I think the rabbi mentioned it as well, in the emergency department all the time. I last year treated a man who broke his hand, and I asked him how he had broken his hand, and he said, I broke it on my girlfriend's face. And I still provide him the same level of care because it's not up to me to decide if he is moral or not. And I think the slippery slope argument, is a good one. Who am I to say that this person is moral and that person isn't? I think as a society, we have to come together to decide how are we going to make those decisions? And society has not bestowed that in the arena of physicians.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a wonderful discussion. And I want to also read some of the responses that have come in from some of the others. Dr. Winia has said the should you kill Hitler problem is a variant of the trolley problem. Would you kill one to save many? It's a test of how much you believe in utilitarian thinking. Tessa Shalous from Israel says this is something that many Israeli physicians face here all the time, but the ethics are pretty clear-cut in these cases. Ethically, we have to care for these patients. And Matt Winia goes on to point out that in non-hypothetical situations, clinicians at Boulder Community Hospital provided good care to the shooter. The staff at Deaconess in Boston provided good care to the Boston Marathon bomber. The answer to do you treat bad guys is yes, we do that. Susan Sirkin from Physician for Human Rights says, the Israeli government could not find a single Israeli doctor to force feed hunger striking detainees adhering to the World Medical Association ethical codes against violating the autonomy of the individual who conscientiously chose this manner of protest. And the IMA, the Israel Medical Association, supported this ethical stance as far as she knows. And Tessa pointed out that the Israeli Medical Association came out really strongly against that. I think professional ethics certainly does come to the fore and must be respected under that situation. But it's a very hard choice. I think using Hitler as the example is probably the most difficult one that one could ever come to. How do we help our compatriots when they face, our colleagues rather, and even yourself, when you recognize that something awful has happened? Perhaps you fell asleep at the wheel and ordered the wrong drug, or something happened untoward and you are ashamed of your own behavior. How do you deal with that moving forward? I'd welcome any of the panelists to step up.
Well, Mark, I was thinking during the question you posed about Hitler that when I was doing a lot of long-term care and rehab work, we had a book that was called Everyday Ethics. I have to pull it out of my bookshelf and I'll send you all the reference. But we pose these big picture questions, which are really important, and thank you for sparking that conversation. But the truth is that what you're getting at is we all face these issues every single day, whether it's in our ambulatory practice, in the emergency room, in a nursing home. But these are issues of what do we do if the patient wants this kind of food versus that kind of food? What do we do at a place like Stride, which is a federally qualified health center, where I am learning over my new practice there how challenged many of our patients are in terms of social determinants of health, and how we need to be looking at those issues and trying to sort those things out. And I think that these kinds of challenges in care are only increasing. And so your question about how we help each other and hopefully then our patients and our clients through these challenges is an important one to have on the table. For me, it's about, one, understanding one's own limits, one's own judgments, and then trying to set those aside if possible. It's keeping the patient's values, front and center. And when there's a conflict between the organization and the values, or your own values and the patient, to really try to take a breath and understand those, and then find colleagues and others to have conversations with. And I think that's where we have huge opportunity in our organizations to do better at having those conversations. I know that in my recent organizations, a lot of our meetings are around how many patients did you see, and how many mammograms did you order, and did you do their advanced directives? And those are important metrics, and I don't mean to make light of that, but we have to start including some of these other conversations in those meetings as a way to help each other with these questions. And this issue that Abby and Janine, I think, got to, which is so important, which is, who are we to judge? And do we have an ability to make relationship even when patients and families might be making choices that we personally don't really agree with? And in my practice with older adults, I certainly deal with that every day.
Yeah, another perspective on the question of dealing with an untoward event, I think, is the importance of honestly speaking out and up and admitting, not hiding behind a facade. The burden of carrying that guilt without acknowledging it can sometimes add to the moral distress that people have as a result of an untoward event. I'm going to refer now to some questions from the audience that have come through in the chat. And here is one that has come in regarding moral versus ethical decisions with regard to the continual development of weapons of mass destruction. Many physicians, Dr. Helen Caldecott among them, have mulled over this conundrum for decades now without resolve. I'd like to hear from these outstanding panelists their intuitive responses to this ongoing dilemma that's germane to this whole discussion. Anybody want to step in on that one?
I would like to know what the definition of a weapon of mass destruction is and where we draw that line. Because to me, frankly, machine guns being sold widely throughout the United States, I don't even know what they're called, where you can keep shooting at people, to me is a weapon of mass destruction. So I think that to me is part of the discussion, and do, as a society, does everyone have a right to buy a gun? Because that's a weapon of mass destruction in our society. So I'd like to flip that a little bit. I think, we're seeing mass shootings all the time. We had a little bit of a break during the pandemic, but now that we're opening back up, I think we're right where we were before. So I'd love to hear from other people on the panel where they draw their line on the weapons of mass destruction discussion in and of itself also.
Yeah, I can't say I know exactly what the question is referring to. I will say that one of sort of a tangential area for me, when I think about weapons of mass destruction and the physician's role, I think about the role in the Cold War of that physician group led by Dr. Geiger. I forget the name of it, but it was very prominent in sort of publicizing the public health effects of nuclear war and using that as a way to fight for what they knew was wrong on multiple moral and ethical levels. I would actually extend that and say, now what about climate change and global warming? And if that is a threat to health, should we be using the same strategies that were previously used for nuclear weapons to think about our threats to humanity on a much broader scale? But I do think there is an obligation to speak up. The question is who? Is it every physician, or is it just physicians who feel very passionately about nuclear weapons? Or is it, just the biggest physician at the biggest hospital? And I'm not sure what the answer is there, because I don't think every physician feels that obligation.
Any other comments from the panelists? Then let me, another question that has come in from the audience is, could our panelists give more examples of small acts of moral courage, similar to those that Abby has mentioned?
I can talk about one that many of my colleagues have taken on. So in the state of Colorado, prisoners, and that includes immigrants held for seeking asylum in our detention center in Aurora, are grouped settings, high risk for COVID. And Governor Polis has not authorized vaccination against COVID for this incredibly high risk population. And so there's been lots of letter writing speaking out on behalf of these people. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten very far. There's been letter writing done at local hospitals, also early in the pandemic, arguing that if you look at sort of the health of the community, taking that argument, if in Aurora, everyone, at the time, there were 1,500 immigrants, adult immigrants held because they were seeking asylum. Now it's down to about 220 adults. But if they all got COVID and got sick and needed to use all of our ventilators, then we wouldn't have ventilators for everybody else, if you want to play that game as well. Unfortunately, that didn't push hospital systems to act and speak out. And this gets to sort of a discussion about what status quo and what people are willing to accept and what people are willing to speak out about, and what do you choose to speak out about, and what risks do you put yourself at, as Barbara Morris has, for your job and other things. I think that's been I guess, I don't know if that's a small act. I think that people have continued to speak out about this, but right now the people in these detention centers and prisons haven't been vaccinated in our state.
Thank you, Janine, for the comment. I don't have the expertise to comment on some of what I think of as these really kind of big initiatives, population-based, prison-based, but I go back to when people ask for examples of moral courage. I don't know if these are moral courage, but I think that the examples I think of go to my clinical practice mostly, where every day I work with older adults and their families to help them wind their way through our health system, which is usually challenging and is often leading them down a road that they really don't want to go on. And they feel, our patients and their families often feel that, well, the specialist, the oncologist told me this, I should do this, or this person said that, and they have kind of lost their grounding, their personal sense of where they want to be. And so I think that that's very hard work. Does that make it moral courage? I don't know, but I do know it's hard work. And I know there are some days where all of us think, oh, I just can't go there in that discussion. And then we have to take a deep breath and say, how are we to advocate for our patients, both as individual persons, which is really all we can do every day, and then as groups of people in terms of programs and services and what we can provide for patients. So I think for whoever asked the question, as you look into what you do every day, you're probably going to realize that you are doing small or big things every day that would probably meet the definition of moral courage, I hope. And what we need to do is, I think, air those things more and help people feel better about that and feel supported. Because that's also what our populations need wherever you work, is that they're going to look for you if you get fired. You know, one other thing I would say, my patients, initially the first reaction when I got fired before it was public as to the reason, the first response was calling my medical assistant saying, is she sick? What happened to her? Because they knew I would not leave them abruptly like that. So that was the first question. After the staff said, no, she's not sick. Then they said, when it came out what had happened, that I was fighting for my patient, then the patients were like, oh, of course she was. You know, like, you go, girl. You know, we know you do that for me, and you go. And then I was getting messages about what did I need, you know, food, money, other things. And I can laugh about that now. Obviously, it was not very funny at the time, but it was very supportive. And so we know that our populations, whoever they are, wherever you work, will hear you if you do these things.
And I'd like to say something in response to that comment from Dr. Morris. Again, I'm not a clinician, but I do say, well, in my own personal, thought process, I would not have counseled congregants in the same way. I do believe that what you're touching on is the definition of, or certainly something that needs to be worked into the moral fabric of a medical training, as well as medical practitioners, which is a constant reflection on what is the essential values that drive my life as a medical practitioner. It would be the same in any field, truly, but because you're dealing with people, it's like Viktor Frankl said that anyone who has a why can survive any how or any what. And the why of the doctors, the why of any medical practitioner is something that I would advocate should be asked from every medical student to reflect on every day. It would be the equivalent of what's been advocated, and I personally support this strongly, that every student in public school should have a personal moment of reflection every day on the values that their parents teach them, on the supreme being as defined by their parents. It's not a religious thing in the schools, but a moment to reflect on a value system, because if it's just about the how and the structure of medicine and what we're doing and the techniques and the charts that we're filling out and the procedures, the humanity that you've expressed in the way you relate to your patients is exemplary. And I think that humanity and that connection to the person and the realization that there's a person that you're talking to, not a patient or not a client, is something that I think needs to be woven into the daily practice of truly everybody. The reflection on what is it within the person that makes them a person, rather than just a person. And I think that even a moment of reflection every day on that is something that could change also the burnout and also the definition of values and morality in the medical field as the generations continue to grow and in the whole society.
I'll add one very easy example. Just going off of what the rabbi said about sort of seeing the whole person. In medical school, I always made sure to feed patients if they were able to, or if they said they were hungry. It is like a tiny thing, but it makes such a difference in patients feeling heard and valued. And that's not the way our medical system is built. Those are not the quality metrics. Nobody's going to say, good job, you fed all your patients today. But just taking those little steps, to me, are really important to retaining those values that brought you into medicine, or at least brought me into medicine. And so I think because it does often feel like it goes against all of the incentives and pressures and the things that we're actually graded as medical students and then evaluated and paid based on as physicians, I think that can be an act of courage.
I'd also add, Abby, and I really appreciate you bringing that up, is I think it's important to learn people's languages, or at least try. How do you say hello, or thank you, or beautiful child? You know, and I think it's a equalizing measure so that we're not in this hierarchy, and people can laugh at your accent, and you're more at the level of just another human being trying to learn about someone else.
Well, thank you all very much to every one of the panelists and for this wonderful discussion. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the time allotted. The next year, I hope, will go by much smoother and and nicer to us than the last year has been. We had to cancel this program last year because of the pandemic. And hopefully we can look forward to doing it again next year. Next year's program is going to focus upon the legacy of the Holocaust regarding particularly health equity and social justice, which I know has been on the minds of many of us very much over the last few years. That'll be April 25 through 29 of 2022. Our keynote speaker next year is going to be Aletha Maybank, who is the Chief Health Equity Officer of the AMA, the first one who has ever held that position. It should be an engaging program, just hopefully as nice as this one has been this year. Thank you all for your participation and your contributions, and I look forward to repeating this again next year. Bye-bye.